Howdy, this is Reagan for Corgilope, and this is a tutorial on how to hand sew a spot. I'm using a pattern here. You really don't need to since a spot is a really simple shape, but I'm just doing it to illustrate. Here I'm drawing on the direction of the faux fur. Once again, you don't need to do this, it's just a circle. So I'm tracing my pattern to make sure that I have enough room for my seam allowance. I'm going to be putting this yellow fluorescent green fur into this blue fur. So I'm tracing my spot and then I'm tracing the hole. It's the exact same shape. I'm cutting it out with scissors. You could use scissors or a utility knife. You see, you make very, very small cuts with your scissors so that you don't cut the length of the faux fur. You just want to cut the backing. You see, I'm using a very small seam allowance on this spot. You can use a larger seam allowance or no seam allowance at all. It's really about how comfortable you are with sewing. Instead of using that little snip I showed earlier, I used just a big cut so they can get into the circle. And now I'm using those tiny cuts so that I don't cut the length of the faux fur again. So now I have a hole in the blue, and I'm putting that green into the hole, kind of tucking the fur so it's easier to work with. That's a wonder clip. I like to use them to pin fur. You don't need a wonder clip for this process, but I'm just showing right now that the lines that you drew for your pattern, they'll line up perfectly. So you can see right now, that spot fits perfectly into the hole. It'll kind of look kind of bunched, see bunched on the back. Don't worry about that, you'll deal with that later after you finish sewing. So right now I'm just going to use a hand needle along with upholstery thread. I use upholstery thread when I'm hand sewing because it's a very, very strong thread. You can pull it as tight as you want to. I've only been able to break it with my hands once, and my hands hurt so bad. You can see this right there. I'm trying to pull it with my hands, and you can see it's kind of, my fingertips are getting red, and there's like white where the thread is. It's such a strong thread. I like to use this strong thread because when you're making your little stitches, you can pull it as tight as you want to make sure that the fabric is really snug. So what you're going to do is you take your needle and place it through the line, and then you'll go and place it through the other line so that the good sides of the fur smash up together. You can see right here. And then you go back through the backing, and you go back to the other side. A lot of people get nervous when they're hand sewing faux fur or just sewing faux fur in general. You really don't need to be too afraid about it because faux fur, especially the longer faux fur like this, is about a 2.5 inch pile length. It'll cover up all of your mistakes, or almost all of your mistakes. It's a great fabric. It'll cover up wrinkles. If your pattern is a little off, it has a slight stretch to it, so don't worry. So I'm going to really speed up this video, but what I'm doing here is basically a very sloppy backstitch. I like using backstitches in areas that are going to deal with like a lot of pressure. So if something breaks on your fursuit, like say a stress tear, like maybe in the groin area or the armpit, that's where I use a backstitch. So kind of skipped forward here, but now I'm going to do a knot. You see you'll have a loop right here. If you go through one side and back through the other, you kind of have that loop if you don't pull the thread all the way, and then you want to go back through the loop before you pull it tight. So I'm going to go back through the loop, and before pulling it tight again, I'm going to hold that other side and pull it tight so that I have another loop. I usually do this twice to get a knot, but if you're feeling nervous, you could do this 5 times if you want. That's a little excessive, but see, I do it about like 2 or 3 times, and then I put my finger down and pull the thread tight. I put my finger down because sometimes if I don't pull my finger down, sometimes the thread will knot far away from the fabric, so you'll have this like really long knot and it'll come loose. So I always put my finger down to make sure that the knot ends up right against the seam allowance. Now I'm doing a different stitch here. This is just like a whip stitch. You can see this isn't really sped up at all, and you can see how much quicker it is because all you're doing is you're going through one side, back through the other, just like you're running around the seam allowance. This stitch is good if you just want to close something really quickly. I use this for when I'm closing the base of tails, or if there's just like a little hole someplace that needs to be closed where there won't be any pressure. So if you had like a hole, I don't know, around your like forearm, there's no pressure there, so you can use that stitch. It's really quick, really simple, and you knot it the same way that we did that back stitch. Here I'm tucking the fur in so it's out of the way. So now I'm using a blanket stitch, which is kind of like that whip stitch, but instead, before we pull the thread tight, we go through this loop. And it'll kind of, blanket stitches, they're sometimes called a ladder stitch because it kind of makes an L shape that looks like a ladder over your seam allowance. A little more secure than the whip stitch. And once again, we knot this just like the other ones. So we put it through that loop, we keep the loop on the other side, and do it again. When it comes to cutting the thread, I always leave like a little bit. I don't cut it very close to the seam. It just makes I feel like it's more secure that way. It makes me feel better. So you can see we have our very sloppy back stitch. Then we have our whip stitch. We're just kind of went over the seam allowance. And right there is our blanket stitch. You can kind of see a little bit where the thread, it runs along the top, kind of forms this L pattern. And there's our spot. So once you finish sewing, just take a brush of some sort and brush all that fur out of the seam. Don't really, when you're brushing your fursuit, you want to brush in the direction of the fur, but when you're done sewing, just brush in every direction you want to, so you can kind of force that fur out of the seam allowance. You can also tell it's not a perfect circle, and the reason is because the fur is so long. If you want a perfect circle, you can go and take some scissors and do some light trimming around the edges, or a clipper, like a shaver that people use for fursuit heads, and do a light shaving. So, there's your spot. You now know 3 techniques to hand sew a spot.